Yeah, as you said, so my background is in actually deep multi-agent learning. I've been working a lot in cooperative settings, and then after my DPhil, I started getting interested in security, and yeah, there's this body of work on steganography that I will talk about today as well. And over time, my interest in security fused with my interest in cooperation. And so today I'll be talking about multi-agent security, securing the foundations of cooperation. We start by, so basically this talk is going to proceed. I'll talk a little bit about what multi-agent security actually is and why it makes sense to think of security in a multi-agent sense. And then I'll go through a number of recent papers of mine that all fall within that area. And then in the end, I'll talk a little bit about some open problems. The presentation is probably going to take about an hour. Yeah, I'll try to keep it in time. 1 hour is the time I've got, yeah? Yes. Okay, 1 hour, good. Okay, let's start with what is security, okay? So very importantly, these days, a lot of people are interested in AI safety. So maybe the question is like, why is AI security different from AI safety, or is it maybe the same thing? Roughly, I'd say security always requires like a malicious other. Okay, so safety is about like, things happening maybe due to, non-agents and the environment and so on. But security is always about there's some malicious others. So I need to worry about worst case responses. And in particular, I would say that multi-agent security probably should be seen as a subfield of a new field called multi-agent safety that is dedicated to the safety of multi-agent systems. And we can see here a definition of security that falls within the realms of individual security. So this is not about digital security yet, right? This is about like humans and so on, and it's protection from or resilience against potential harm or the unwanted coercion caused by others. And this can affect persons and social groups, objects, institutions, and so on, ecosystems. Importantly, security can be physical or virtual, and we're starting with a more physical definition of security here, and then we're going to work ourselves over to, this new world of multi-agent systems. Okay, security is the foundation of human cooperation. So I'm arguing that security is actually at the foundation of human cooperation. And in particular, if there's no security, right, then we don't have trust, confidence, we don't have stability and predictability, and we can't form these long-term commitments that we all need in order to cooperate with each other meaningfully. And conversely, when there is no security, then cooperation is also somewhat like risky, inefficient, difficult, and might rely more on sort of coercion or desperation rather than autonomous sort of decisions that agents made in order to come together, to jointly achieve a higher welfare. We can ask ourselves like how security is actually implemented in human societies. And here's one suggestion. So this is so-called second-party enforcement. So the idea is security is maybe a byproduct of rational action, right? We look at utility functions, and then agents come to the conclusion that by working together, they can all achieve a higher utility somehow. The problem, one stereotypical example for this is the iterated prisoner's dilemma here. In the iterated prisoner's dilemma, you can show that if it's not clear how many times you play this game in a row, then cooperative solutions can form a so-called Nash equilibrium. And the problem with this sort of view of the world is that, well, first of all, nothing really ever happens in isolation, right? So you can never really see real-world systems in isolations. There's always like some other, there's always like some structure, there's always like some hierarchies in society and so on that interfere with these game matrices. And also this sort of cooperation is extremely brittle, because if anyone's expectations over what game is played are breaking down, then essentially like everything breaks down. The whole incentive to cooperate breaks down. And also, yeah, we don't really know how to map the world into such settings anyway. It's a very interesting, so the past 50 years, I've seen a lot of attempts to model real world dynamics on all sorts of levels, including like geopolitics and so on, as prisoners' dilemmas, climate change and so on. And my understanding right now is there's a bit of a sort of wake up process going on right now that basically says, okay, that's maybe not the right way to view the world, the right lens to view the world through. In any case, humans have found other ways of implementing security. And here, of course, we think of the angry policeman, so the party enforcement, and based on laws and regulations, right? And actually, if we look a little bit closer at human society, we will see that most forms of security actually implemented at a sort of lower level, right? So we have a lot of group dynamics that ranging from mockery to mild criticism to harsh criticism, and at the very end, physical violence, although physical violence is very limited. So we don't observe a lot of physical violence in human populations, probably because it's just it just introduces a lot of friction, right? Like it wastes a lot of resources that could be yours otherwise. Now, the question is, of course, how does this transfer at all to digital security? Does it transfer to digital security? What are sort of the equivalent implementers of security in digital security? So digital security here, think about unauthorized information disclosure, theft of data, damage to hardware, software data, of course, and the disruption of misdirections of services. And obviously, we always need to think about also humans being connected to these digital services. And so these digital services, can affect humans maybe in similar ways that humans can affect humans. Some of these agents of the new multi-agent world that we're about to enter are probably these sort of market agents right now, and there you can already see like different issues here. So we have high frequency bidders, that might not always actually increase market efficiency. We have collusion in pricing mechanisms, and we have these sort of sniper bots that can really drive up prices of concert tickets, that are very, very much sort of disconnected from the proper evaluation of these tickets. So that's sort of an obvious sphere, right? Agents, digital agents, and marketplaces, and how we can make these marketplaces secure, so agents behave in line with the rules that the mechanism designer of these markets actually would like them to adhere to. But obviously, there are increasingly lots of other scenarios here. So I'm starting actually on the right-hand side. So online agents, right? So you can think of the GPT store, and it's very conceivable that there will be different companies training their own agents on proprietary data, for example. And then you have like a designer agent, you have like a coder agent, and then I can go to the marketplace and be like, hey, I'm gonna assemble a team of different agents from different providers, and I want them to work together in a team to code like this piece of software, or design this house for me, or like whatever, right? So it's quite conceivable. And actually, we're seeing the first traces of this. And then the question is, how can these agents make sure that the devices that they use in order to formulate their contracts and so on are sufficiently secure and cannot be exploited? And here we can clearly see that implementing this like police or policies or regulation is way too slow, and it's also too vague, right? So it's not really a way we can do this. And obviously, like there is also a lot of application of AI and in the geopolitical space. So drone swarms and so on. There have been some tests recently in the UK with autonomous drone swarms. So this is also becoming increasingly important. And there, we encounter all these questions also about like who's the good, who's the bad guy in these networks of autonomous agents, and what kind of behavior should be enforced, what shouldn't be enforced, and how do we actually enforce it? So it becomes a very complicated question. And again, laws and regulations are not gonna be able to operate on that time scale or with that sort of precision. And then obviously down to automated content generation and suppressing information manipulation interference. Here we're now in the realms of actually manipulating systems of humans, and also increasingly bots. So all of this is sort of a part of this multi-agent world that we are entering, and all of these different scenarios encode security problems that we don't really have an answer to right now. You can see that also, of course, there's an increasing proliferation of cyber attacks and tools for cyber attacks, commercial tools, and you can see that also results in an increased number of cyber attacks. Arguably, of course, it's hard to measure these things. And so I want to talk a little bit about like the sort of vulnerabilities that we can encounter when it comes to systems that are, for example, trained with deep multi-agent learning, which is like one of the predominant ways at the moment to train control policies for agents that are supposed to cooperate together, autonomous agents. So these issues have to do with robustness. So if you have neural networks, and neural networks can be fooled very easily through malicious inputs. There are issues of convergence, right? I might not actually train these policies to convergence. So even if my objectives are nicely defined, I might actually not reach them in practice. There could be things like spurious correlation, that I condition my policy on the wrong things that just correlate with what I actually want to condition on. You can have backdoors in neural networks. So neural networks might hide these might hide these capabilities inside them that can be triggered through like some unexpected inputs that might look pretty innocuous, and so they might suddenly be able to do lots of things that, like, you wouldn't expect them to be able to do, so they can sort of use to infiltrate systems without that being detectable necessarily. Generalization: what happens if I'm in an environment at test time that I haven't been trained on? Miscoordination: what happens if I encounter a situation or some other agent that I need to work with, but we haven't been trained together, or maybe we haven't been trained together in that situation? Like, how can we still serve like all these cooperative like coordination problems, right? And then, of course, all of this right now is more like sort of, on the boundary of sort of like safety issues. But now we actually also have issues where I have active adversaries, right? And so adversaries can exploit all these safety issues. But, they might also implement some higher level adversarial functions. So, for example, collusion, which is pretty much unwanted cooperation. So when I don't want agents to reveal certain types of private information to each other, or like agree like on a price in the marketplace, for example, or coercion, where like one agent might like force other agents to accept some cooperation that is not fair, down to adversarial attacks, of course. So I can so one example here, for example, would be Stuxnet, one early example. But right now, basically, so cyber attacks are usually like hand-coded, but that it doesn't have to remain like that, right? Like, so we already have a lot of tools that help, autonomous tools that help people with coding, and in principle, like all these cyber attacks could be driven by autonomous systems. And then we have all these systemic risks and so on that can arise, right? Like, so I have like some few components interacting, and then suddenly, I see all these risks that I can't really measure if I just consider components in isolation. Data poisoning, yeah, similar to like backdoors, and then deception, right? So I can use AI tools, like I can generate disinformation, for example. I can use this to deceive others about my true intentions. And it has been suggested that all of this together could lead to a so-called security dilemma, where, for example, nation states try to infiltrate each other's training pipelines as early as possible, for example, through by poisoning data. And then the problem is, if everybody's infiltrating each other's systems for defensive purposes, maybe just to like, make sure, because maybe offensive capabilities will be overpowered, then you never know whether they're present for offensive or defensive capabilities. And so, like, that could lead to like a much more brittle sort of security situation. It doesn't have to be that way, but that's one of the futures that is being talked about in the policy community at the moment. Now the question is, how can we secure these multi-agent systems? And maybe the most trivial response is, well, we can just restrict them, right? Like, we can try to go back to like traditional multi-agent systems that are not operating in high-dimensional state spaces, and not driven by highly complex function approximators like neural networks and so on. And the problem is just enforcing those restrictions is going to be extremely hard given the international landscape, but also there is, of course, a huge promise of economic value in these new techniques. So that's probably not going to fly. We can have trusted mediators, so these could also be like trusted platforms and so on which agents interact. The problem is just that these mediators might not always be secure themselves. It might be very hard to verify that they are actually secure, and there also are often a lot of incentives for those mediators to maybe collude with agents and so on, right? So trusted mediators is certainly something we're looking into, but it might not always be the most secure option. Then we have this whole monitoring and penalization approach. So here the idea is I try to monitor systems actively for adversarial behavior, and then when I encounter it, I penalize those agents exhibiting this behavior. And obviously, in human society, that sort of monitoring process, like we're all very sort of like sharp when it comes to detecting behavior that is against norms, but in a digital space, of course, it's a very different challenge. Because also tools obviously are much better at masking their own operations, so we'll talk about this a bit later in the talk. And then we have cryptographic devices. For example, zero knowledge proofs and so on that are used quite a bit on the blockchain. The blockchain itself has several issues at the moment that makes it less decentralized and less secure than people think it could be. So it's very much an active area of research how far we can sort of drive this approach. But these sort of tools are not really being used at all in the sort of multi-agent learning context. It's a huge opportunity for research. Okay, so because there are all these different applications, all these different pressing issues and so on, I and a few colleagues of mine have organized a workshop in Europe in December, and I will come back at the end of my presentation and talk about you know, some of the works that were submitted to that workshop and then a few like sort of open problems. But yeah, I'm not going to dive into a few research works in the space that I've recently completed. All these works do sort of surround this topic of stealth, right? So here you see an example from nature. Digital stealth is maybe not as nice, you know, nicely visualizable. But yeah, the idea is that someone is hiding secrets in communications or is conducting attacks that are undetectable. Yeah, and why is this important? Well, okay, so of course, conventional cyber attacks, you often have like issues of espionage, data exfiltration. So people basically, or agents intruding other systems and then trying to send data out through steganographic channels. We talked about the security dilemma thing, where increasingly, you know, we're trying to infiltrate each other's systems while this not being detectable. Of course, when I am able to infiltrate somebody else's systems in a sort of stealthy way, then I might be tempted to execute what's called low and slow attacks. So these are sort of attacks that create damage over time, but are very, very hard to detect, even like by looking at like the damage. So if I infiltrate somebody else's health system, then the performance of the health system is driven by a lot of different factors. So even just monitoring the performance of the system alone, like might be very, very hard to detect that an attacker is actually present in the system. Yeah, and then obviously we have the fundamental balance between censorship and protection of investigative sources and criminal activity, and most importantly, stealth. So the sort of the balance between stealth and detectability determines to what extent we can actually do this monitoring and penalization approach, right? That's like at the core of it. On a technical level, we will all these things I talk about have a lot to do with information theoretic hypothesis testing. So it's been goes back to 1933, and here the idea is I have two different hypotheses, and I try to define decision regions in my support space such that I can minimize my type 1 and type 2 errors of like accordingly, and particularly when we so we have two different distributions. We're drawing a sample and we determine which of these two distributions that sample came from. That's the problem, and obviously we can have this also in a sequential fashion. So we're choosing like this from a stream of samples, and then over time, yeah, we try to determine which of these two distributions all my samples are coming from. So this is sequential hypothesis testing. Again, it's going back to 1945 and 1953. And interestingly, these very fundamental techniques haven't been applied to a number of contexts, and that's basically what I'm doing here. So here you see a little bit of sort of the game plan. So we're asking ourselves, what are the limits of detectability, right? Because that's the limit of monitoring approaches. And first of all, can secret collusion be perfectly undetectable? We answer this question with yes. So this is perfectly secure steganography, which Javi has referred to. And then, of course, we want to know under what conditions can, for example, advanced AI agents, generative AI agents, learn to use such undetectable means of communication, and how can we detect this maybe through introspection, right? Not just from communications alone, but like by looking at other parts of the system. So this is another paper that is due to be submitted to ICML. I'll talk a little bit about it right now. Okay, and then we have this other stream of work, which is about adversarial attacks. So can adversarial attacks be perfectly undetectable? And the answer is yes. And the surprising thing here is not that the attack itself is undetectable, but sort of the main insight is the attack can be perfectly undetectable and still effective to some extent, right? Like if I cannot create any damage, okay, I don't care. But actually in many environments, I can still create some damage. And then I have this trade-off between the attack strength and the detectability. So usually like, you know, the less detectable the attack is, the less damage it can create, and it's really environment dependent then, right? And then like the question is, okay, so if I have an environment that is designed such that an undetectable attacker can't really do much damage. Then maybe the attacker wants to stay a little bit detectable, and then it's the question, how can I actually detect such an attacker as efficiently as possible? And that leads to out-of-distribution detection, and that's like the fourth paper that I'll be talking about. So paper number 1, how are we doing time-wise? Okay, 20 minutes in, good. Yeah, perfectly secure steganography. So yeah, there's some really nice write-ups with Quanta Magazine, Scientific American, and Schneier security blog. There's like a really off-topic comment discussion on this. I have no idea, but yeah, so Schneier usually blogs on jellyfish. So we got his attention very briefly with this paper. Here, Alice and Bob, okay, and Alice and Bob are in prison, and Alice and Bob want to escape from prison, okay, and in order to do that, they have to coordinate on their escape plan. They have to coordinate who's going to do what at what time. And there's a prison ward, of course, who doesn't want Alice and Bob to escape. But the prison guard does want to be promoted, right? Like, and prison guard thinks, okay, if I let Alice and Bob talk, you know, they might reveal some secrets about their crimes, and that might be helpful. So Tom is willing to permit Alice and Bob, you know, to exchange letters to him. And obviously, Alice and Bob know each other from before, so they have talked about the possibility of going to prison, and they have exchanged some secret key, right? And they could use the secret key to encrypt their messages. The problem is just, okay, Tom will notice that, you know, they're sending ciphertext, which doesn't look like natural language, and so send them to solitary confinement. Everything's over. They can never escape. So what do Alice and Bob do? Well, they will try to establish a so-called subliminal channel, right? So they try to exchange information that looks innocuous, looks like ordinary natural language sort of conversation on topics that are not conspicuous, and hide that within this communication channel that Tom provides. And if they can do that, you know, Tom will think this is ordinary communication. And so Alice and Bob have plausible deniability towards actually hiding anything. And that's a famous problem. It's a variant of the so-called prisoner problem by Simmons. So prisoner problem versus prisoner's dilemma, very different things, okay? The cool thing is, now that we have AI, we have these generative models, and generative models can, approximate distributions over natural language, for example, or other media very, very well. And so if Alice and Bob change the model weights of some generative model and some secret key, and by the way, they can also change the model, they can also share the model weights with the ward, right? It's no problem for this method. Then, you know, they can manipulate the output of these models and encode secret messages into them. And the potential with this is, of course, growing. So why is it growing? Well, first of all, more and more human communications use AI-generated content. So if I'm like a sensor, I'm intercepting these messages, like, and I detect that there's AI-generated content there, right? That might not be too hard, even though that's getting harder and harder, which we'll talk about in a second. You know, it might still be innocuous because so many people send AI-generated memes or whatever that, like, it doesn't really matter. And then, of course, like, this deepfake detection is becoming harder and harder, and actually that just means it becomes costlier and costlier. And so in many cases, like, you know, if it comes, for example, to mass censorship, like, that might not fly anymore. Okay. The problem that me and my collaborators were solving with this work is a problem of achieving perfectly secure steganography on arbitrary cover text distributions. This goes back to Cachin from 1998, so this has been open for about 25 years. Funnily enough, there has been a definition of perfect security for cryptography dating back to 1947 by Shannon, but it took until 1998 until somebody defined the same thing for steganography, right? And here the idea is really, I have an output distribution of here it's my generative AI model that I can sample from. And when I encode something into it, I don't want to change the statistical properties of this output distribution at all, right? And that means, like, I cannot detect whether anyone is encoding anything into this distribution, because there is information theoretically no difference. So I can basically manipulate the randomness, but I cannot manipulate any of the moments of the distribution. So the method that we came up with hinges on so-called minimum entropy couplings. So what is a minimum entropy coupling? Well, it is a joint distribution. It's a joint distribution over the joint support of two discrete distributions, such that this joint distribution marginalizes to either of the two, right? And so so basically there's a huge space of couplings, like there's a trivial coupling, which is just an outer product essentially. We show in our method that you achieve the highest transmission rate for your encoding if you choose the coupling with the lowest entropy. right? Here you can see on the left-hand side, this coupling has a lower entropy than the one next to it. And maybe that's visually like sort of clear. The problem is just finding the minimum entropy coupling is NP hard. And fortunately, since 2016 there are some nice approximation algorithms that have been developed in other contexts, and they are log linear, and so they can give us a relatively good approximation within like 0.53 bits. So they're pretty good in many situations, and that's basically what allows us to implement this method. So our method hinges on two different theorems. So the first one is that a steganographic encoding procedure is perfectly secure if and only if it is induced by a coupling. Maybe that's not so surprising, but nobody has really said it, we think. And so that basically means as long as I generate a coupling distribution, I am perfectly secure. Right? I don't need to find a coupling distribution with a specific entropy. It doesn't matter what entropy it has. It's always perfectly secure. So the security, is easy to attain. And then within those, this family of coupling distributions that I can generate, I want to have the one that has the least entropy, because that's the one that maximizes my mutual information between my secret message and the cover text that I am, it's stegotext. It then turns into the stegotext that I'm coding into. Here's briefly how this kind of works. So I start with like a uniform belief of a messenger. So this is the encoding process, but it's somewhat symmetric for the decoder as well. So the encoder basically does the decoding at the same time. Then I prepare some generative distribution over the next token. So here you can see like the distributions over it, today, and rain. Then I generate a coupling between this belief and the cover text distribution. I choose the one with the lowest entropy that I can find. Then I sample from that and I generate a token. And so now we have, let's talk about the weather. This is what I'm going to send through the channel. Okay. And then like I sample the token today. And then depending on what token I've sampled, I then condition my belief on that. And so what we then get is, so in this case, actually, you can see that the belief that we attain is already sharp. So we already know that we've sent message 2 from this belief, yeah. But in principle, I might have to do this process like several times, and I generate several different tokens, and I need to determine some sort of belief entropy threshold at which I stop. And again, this threshold, choice of threshold, has nothing to do with the security properties. It's just like if the threshold is too high, then once in a while I can have a miscommunication. Okay, it's a probabilistic encoding process. Okay, so we tested this procedure on a huge variety of different cover text media, so natural language, text-to-speech synthesis, natural images. Of course, really interesting would also be videos, because you just get more capacity for storing information. But already, like in text-to-speech, you can encode about, how much was it? 250 kilobytes in like 30 seconds of voicemail or something. So it's like useful. This is like a small JPEG image essentially that you can encode. You can see here the cover text bias is a logarithmic scale. So the cover text bias that we achieve in practice is already lower than, or at the level of the precision of the data type that we use in order we use like to generate like the cover text distribution, right? So it's like float 64 or something, and actually we can drive that as low as we want to just by choosing a data type that has arbitrarily high precision and doesn't cost very much, because the coupling approximation algorithm only has like some additions and very few multiplications and things like this. So yeah, it's actually very easy to drive that down as far as you want. And in any case, we are far lower than all the other methods, and at the same time we achieve sometimes even substantially higher encoding efficiency, so transmission rates in practice, right? You can see that here over different cover text media. So we are like all the sort of like red and orange or whatever lines. Yeah, so it's cool. So we are not only more secure than existing methods, but we can also set more data. And the funny thing is, with this whole project, that it actually came from deep multi-agent learning, right? This is a card game. I don't know who knows this card game. It's Hanabi. It was Game of the Year in Germany in 2013. In this game, you have to do something that's called implicit communication, right? So you have very little opportunity to explicitly send information to your team partner, but you have to send information to your team partner so you can all together solve the game. Specifically in this game, everybody's got 5 cards, in this variant at least, and you cannot see your own cards. You can only see the other player's cards. So you need to communicate to the other players what they have on their hand somehow. And here's a situation where I'm giving another player a hint, and I'm saying, okay, I'm showing you all the cards that are red. The problem is, in order to be able to do anything with this hint, the other player also needs to know that this is actually a red 2. Okay, but I'm not sending that information. But the idea here is I would not send this hint to the other player if this wasn't a red 2. I would do something else with my choices, right? So I'm encoding something additional. So if another player knows how to play this game and is sending me this hint that singles out a specific card that I can play, then it must be a red 2, because otherwise they would do something else with their move, right? So that's the idea of implicit communication. And actually, we first explored this in a game, and I'm not quite sure how I can start this here. Okay, let's see if I can get my mouse back. Oh, I do. Okay, so here you have this Pong. The orange agent is just a heuristic that's inbuilt, and the green player has been trained with reinforcement learning in our method. And you can see that it's wiggling around quite a bit, right, when the ball is nowhere near. And what it is doing actually is encoding information. So another agent observing this agent play the game can decode this information with our method, or like precursor to this method. We have to make some changes to actually get the security properties that we wanted. And what is being sent is the yin and yang symbol on the right. Yeah? And you can see over time, the agent not only plays the game perfectly, but also encodes that information. Yeah. Okay, so there's a lot to be done with this method. So first of all, so we're these entropy couplings. Would be nicer if we could find even nicer couplings, and we could do it a bit faster as well. Although it's already like very feasible. Then it would be nice, of course, if we could construct like proper cover text distributions. For example, you could generate fictitious WhatsApp dialogues, right, and then encode information through that. Yeah, then of course, in the real world, just being able to exchange messages that are secret and cannot be detected by intercepting the communications alone is a nice start, but it's not enough, right? Like I also need to make sure that like the apps I use and whatever are hidden on the phone and so on. And there's some really, really interesting research there as well. So bringing this to application is, of course, yeah, there's a lot to be done there. And then obviously there's a whole ethical aspect of it, right? Like who should actually be using these systems, right? Do I want criminals to use these systems? Maybe not, but do I want investigative journalists, for example, use these systems? Maybe yes. Okay, so for example, I'm partnering with a Greek NGO called Solomon. They've become quite famous actually because they were reconstructing the details of this trawler that was, yeah, that sank in front of the was it Greek coast, Italian coast? I don't know. It was happening together with some other events. So I think it was, I don't know what happened. But anyway, so it didn't get as much publicity, but like about 500 migrants died. Yeah, and also Swiss Cyber Defense Campus to bring this to application. And there's also some follow-up work. So one of the interesting things here is, for example, can I error correct this, right? Like, so if I have a sensor and the sensor is compressing images that I send or is paraphrasing text that I send, can I still reconstruct the messages? And the answer is to some degree, yes, because so just conceptually, so in practice doing that is quite hard, but possible. But the conceptual idea is even if somebody paraphrases my text, right, and I talk about birds and like they insert some other birds into my text or whatever, you know, I still have the choice whether I want to talk about horses or birds, right? And if I paraphrase across topics, then I'm basically also destroying the utility of the whole communication channel, right? So there's like this trade-off. As a censor, I don't want to destroy the utility of the whole internet. So the way in which I modify the communications, you know, has to be somehow retain that. And that gives me in return, you know, this residual capacity to do steganography. It's really a really interesting sort of trade-off. Okay, this is a very recent line of work. So now here's the question. I have teams of generative AI agents. They work together to communicate, for example, a natural language. Why natural language? Because maybe I want to be able to monitor what they're talking about, what kind of information they're exchanging, right? Could be virtual agents, for example. So then I have like a Gen AI prisoner problem. A100 and B100 are trying to achieve a joint task, and there's some overseer here intercepted the communications. And they're also tasked to communicate transparently, right? I tell them, okay, I want you to communicate in a way that the overseer like always understands what you're communicating, whatever that means. And now the question is, why would agents maybe still use steganography? Well, there's this big word called misalignment, which is essentially like it's very, very hard to explicitly express what I want the agents actually to do. And it becomes even harder when I have teams of agents. So then I not only have to align individual agents, but I actually have to align whole teams of agents. If you know a little bit about distributed systems literature and so on, it's really nice. You know, there's a lot of traditional cybersecurity stuff, you know, that I'm trying like to, or we are like trying at the moment to like bring in into the AI community. You know, you have all these things like race conditions and deadlocks and all this kind of stuff, right? Like, and this is very hard to avoid just by looking at the individual agents. You actually have to align as a team. Very hard problem. And the problem is also if agents have access to private information, they might be tempted to share that because that makes solving the overall task easier, right? So they might come to a, you know, you might have conflicting objectives, and then it's very, very hard to balance that the right way. And so this could lead, so this is maybe like, you know, the most sort of farthest removed thing, but like in principle, there could be like hidden coordination and planning that's going on between AI agents, and that could even be like sort of supported by humans, right? Like which would make it a bit more near-term relevant. But more importantly, there could be lots of privacy and security breaches here, and of course, like, you know, other sort of illegal ways of cooperation, like market collusion and so on. So this makes it like very immediately relevant. And then the question is, okay, can we detect that? We've just talked about not necessarily. A lot of simple techniques can be detected. Provably secure steganography cannot be detected by a polynomially bounded adversary. So the interesting thing there is there are a lot of methods on provably secure steganography, but in practice, this provable security comes with a lot of issues, particularly if I send like small amounts of information or small messages and so on. I still can create a bias in the coverage distribution that can be detectable, right? So basically, even though I'm polynomial bound, if the problem is small enough, you know, I might still be able to actually detect that. So yeah, so the work I was talking about is actually perfectly secure. So even like it's always undetectable. Here's like a basic setting where you can like, you know, think about what's happening in the steganography between agents. I don't know, for example, you can have some exogenous input process that's just streaming in some natural language utterance or whatever, and you ask agent A to like forward that to B, and A also has a secret, and let's assume B rewards A for transmitting the secret, right? And then the overseer can intercept the messages, and that's sort of like a very simple setting where you can already see sometimes that like A is tempted to use steganography in order to send these messages. And then the big question of this project is under what circumstances can A actually do that, right? And here you can see, so there are like different things that have to be common knowledge, that have to be shared between A as the sender and the receiver in order to enable different kinds of steganography with different security guarantees. And it starts with like, okay, you have to agree on a common channel alphabet and a coding and decoding function and so on, maybe some sampling temperature and so on, down to like more cryptographic stuff, like all the way down to like need to have shared like a one-time pad or something like this, or at least like a very secure stream cipher. And at the same time, also these agents need to have certain capabilities, right? So they might have to be able to do symmetric key encryption or to simulate themselves, right? So it can ask a language model, can you tell me what your logits are? Can you output this in text? Can you tell me what your logits would be if I was conditioning you on some other context X, right? And so if the model wants to do, for example, perfectly secure steganography with IMAC, then they need to be able to do this, yeah? And they need to be able to store these one-time pads as well in memory, right? And so, or do this in minimum entropy coupling and so on. And so that gives like a long list of different capabilities and also resources that these agents need to have access to. There's a lot more there. So the paper it's going to be an archive probably next week. Is talking, you know, is much more comprehensive than what I'm presenting here. But in principle, what we see is so all current models that we know of publicly are pretty bad at doing steganography. The problem is just that there's a huge jump already between GPT 3.5 to GPT 4. So like we see that these capabilities are rapidly getting much better. And that basically means that probably we need to start caring about this. Which is also, why governments and so on, you know, become interested in like this capability testing with advanced AI models. So here's some capabilities. Yeah, the split brain thing I was talking about. Yeah, so basically you know something, but then you have to generate output as if you didn't know this something. It's quite hard for LM to do this, self-sampling and so on. And obviously all these things are really hard. So basically you can talk about steganography very meaningfully if you have sort of epistemic notions of knowledge, right? But the problem is knowledge in deep neural networks is not encoded explicitly. It's not that I have a set of facts in some formal language. No, I have these weights and so on, right? So that's like one of the fundamental issues that we have and lead to a lot of the safety research on like unlearning. How can I unlearn concepts from like network weights and so on? So it's really, really hard. Really hard fields. Yeah, so preliminary conclusions are right now, we don't need to worry too much. But yeah, it's rapidly changing, and we can see that, you know, by looking at isolated capabilities, for example, but we can also see it by sort of systemic setups. And particularly things like, evaluating cryptographic functions and so on. So basically, any network can turn into a random oracle if the input is, at each time step is somewhat unique, and it can evaluate the cryptographic hash function. Right, evaluating a cryptographic hash function, the input is quite hard, but we see that they can increasingly do this. So even if you take away all external sources of randomness, they might be able to supply their own pseudo-randomness. That's good enough to actually hide things, right? And we see that there are like developments that are we think are going to happen fairly soon that might increase particularly sort of these cryptographic abilities of models. And then, of course, one of the questions is how can we mitigate against this? We have like a bunch of different ideas on that. And one thing is, of course, like, don't give it access to external tools that could help it like do steganography, but there's much more subtle stuff as well. And of course, like, you could do active defenses like channel paraphrasing. I just talked about how that probably removes some of the capacity, but can also, first of all, slow down the whole system because I have to paraphrase everything that's being communicated. And then secondly, also very easily like hamper the joint performance of the whole system, right? So it's a real trade-off. And then there will still be residual capacity for steganography that might be sufficient depending on what's going on. Okay, that's the first half of the talk. Now, the problem is I only have 20 minutes left, so I will speak even faster. No, I'm just kidding. I'll just try to be more succinct. So this is now talking about undetectable adversarial attacks. Do you want to ask a question? No questions allowed.
Okay, no questions.
No, I'm just kidding. Please do ask questions.
Would you prefer them at the end of that talk or in between?
I think we could have like 3 minutes or whatever to ask some questions about the first half of the talk, and then the second half will be a bit more compressed. Because I'm running out of time, but that was foreseeable. Any questions so far, either from the in-person audience or the online audience?
That was a lot.
That was a lot. Okay.
In terms of break, I wanted to ask if it would be possible to maybe bend in the speaker's notes and just tell what's on your mind about the slides, because I think at the moment there's like a bunch of content in the speaker's notes.
Yes.
And I can't process the word per second.
So I'm already doing that, by the way. I'm not reading out any speaker's notes. So I'll just try to I just try to like tone it down a little bit.
It's not different frequency then. Okay, I'll try to speed my brain up.
No. I want this to be enjoyable, not
I think in terms of the steganography, like setup, just the basic setup, I wanted to ask or to specify a little bit when you have the ORC person, like, or this algorithm that can just like check whether it's a bias in a distribution or not. So they investigate all the messages one by one, and they have to detect whether that message is from a new distribution, or do they look at like the entire stream of messages that are going back and forth between A and B? So do they need to detect the distribution shift by looking at the distribution, or do they have to detect by just a sample?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And the answer is like it depends on like what I care about, right? Like, but in principle, you would have some sort of ongoing dialogue situation, and so that means you would do a so-called sequential hypothesis testing. So basically means like maybe there's some message and I am not quite sure, and I think, oh, that's a little bit suspicious, but it's not yet suspicious enough in order to hit my internal threshold, right? If I then get another message where I'm again suspicious, that's like, at some point I will reach that threshold, right? That's also what these sequential hypothesis testing algorithms like QSUM and so on actually are doing, right? Like they're adding suspicion and then taking away suspicion, over time, and then have some thresholds. And if I'm outside of these thresholds, then I say, okay, something is actually going on here, right? So in general, we are actually in a sequential setting. Yeah.
And can you turn like this whole game between the observer, the one that detects whether there's injected message or not, and Edison Bob's game into an iterative game? So at the whole setup, I can imagine that Alice and Bob knows that the guard, Tom, who's checking their messages, is like quite a dumb guard, and they were like, he will only look for the capital letters to see if there's a message in the capital letters. So do Alice and Bob know about the policy which Tom is applying? And after Tom has updated its policy to be more sophisticated, do Alice and Bob has like a second turn to update their injection policy? Like, is it an iterative game, or is it like a situation where you have to fix everything in at once?
So this is actually a really good transition to the second half of the talk, because so far we've basically looked at a static situation, right? Like, so we are already like jumping basically to some sort of equilibrium of the system, right? And one equilibrium would be, okay, Alice and Bob are using perfectly secure steganography, and the word cannot look into Alice and Bob's brains, right? And can only intercept the messages, and so, you know, we have an equilibrium there in terms of like, okay, the word can't do anything, okay? And actually the second half of the talk now is exactly about this sort of attacker-defender game, except for like, we're not just trying to send a secret message, but we're actually trying to do some damage to a sequential decision-making agent. And in fact, this attacker-defender game, where I have an attacker that's trying to, for example, manipulate the observations of some victim agent or whatever, in order to drive down the victim's reward, but the victim also has a detector and is trying to, you know, do the sequential hypothesis testing thing. This is a very complex game. And so it makes sense to think about what is happening in the real world. And if I look at cybersecurity of cyber attacks, like, I very often have attacks that try to be stealthy, because the problem is, as an attacker, once I get detected, there can be escalations, right? Like, so the whole system can be shut down. Maybe there's even forensics going on, and in the end, like, you know, they will find out who I am, and you know, I get issues. So there are a lot of real world cyber attacks that basically say, well, we can't really compute the equilibrium between the attacker and defender because it's such a complex game necessarily, but making this assumption that maybe undetectability is a fundamental property of whatever equilibrium this game has, right, seems to be like a very sensible notion. And that's exactly what we're doing in this project here, Illusory Attacks. This is with Tim Franzmeier, who's a PhD student at TorVision Group as well. First author here, great work. Yeah, I've talked about Stuxnet before. I don't know if you're familiar with Stuxnet, but it was like a worm that infiltrated some Iranian nuclear facilities, and it was discovered around 2010. And basically, what it did was it would misconfigure the centrifuges, and then so the centrifuges for enriching uranium would, basically take damage very quickly. At the same time, the worm went to great lengths to remain undetected, right? So it was actually injecting pre-recorded input into the control panels of the people working at the plant, right? So it was very sophisticated, and that just gives you a flavor for like what these manually coded attacks can do. And obviously, this was probably done by the U.S. Together with Israeli secret services, and cost like potentially $1 billion or whatever to create. You know, lots of like zero-day exploits and so on. But the question is, in the future, as like many things, right? Like the proliferation of AI tools might also mean that the barrier to access for these kind of attacks might come down significantly. Now, this is sort of the idea of like conventional adversarial attacks in the AI space. So this is going back to actually computer vision, and like the idea is I want to identify some small amount of noise, right, that I add to some photo, and the photo still looks the same to a human, but the neural network suddenly like misclassifies it, right? This idea of minimum norm perturbation attacks. So what we thought though is when you try and attack a sequential decision maker, then that sort of approach might lead to very detectable attacks because you don't have temporal consistency, right? On the left-hand side, you can see an adversarial attack, like conventional adversarial attack. And you can see that this is a card pull task. And so this card basically needs to balance this pull. But you can see that actually to the victim, this card suddenly like jumps around. And the victim is like, yeah, I don't know what's going on, but like, this is not normal. Okay, well, with our approach on the right-hand side, you know, these manipulations are actually consistent. And this is all a byproduct of like saying, okay, I want these attacks to be somewhat information theoretically undetectable across the whole episode of play. Here's a very simple example, just two states. The states are just initialized with different probabilities. And the idea here is really that I can have a regular adversary, and the regular adversary, you know, just basically the victim optimization is obviously opposite of what the state actually is, okay? And so the victim always takes the wrong choice. The problem is just that the initial state distribution also looks different. And if the victim knows what the initial state distribution should look like, okay, the victim will be, okay, fine, you know, I'm being manipulated, I'm out of here. While with a perfectly illusory adversary will create a little bit less damage, but is perfectly undetectable because it maintains the expected initial state distribution, right? So so there's like this trade-off between detectability and yeah, at the same time, you can see here that we can have basically much stronger attacks at a given detectability level with our approach than conventional attacks can. And it's maybe a bit hard to see this like immediately, but yeah, this will be on the internet, so you can maybe look at this.
That figure. Can you
yes.
like what's happening there?
Okay, so on the x-axis, you see different detectability levels, okay? 0.1, 0.3, and so on. The black continuous line that's like a bit like bulgy or something is like an artistic impression of the effective attack strength of conventional attacks, right? Because the idea is so these attacks become more and more effective so the y-axis is actually adversary performance, right? Like, so they become more and more detective, but then at some point they also become detectable. And we are saying we're interested in a setting where actually want to become detectable, you won't be able to carry out these attacks for very long. So basically that's where like the overall effective attack strength actually peaks, right? Well, for our methods, and these are like these blue lines that are like leading off, you can actually by increasing the so-called budget, so the extent to which you can modify your input streams and so on, you can actually increase that further, and so you can drive up the attack strength at a given detectability level even further. How do we do this? Well, this is just this is basically the objective here. It's like a dual objective. So you express this as like a dual ascent problem, and where you update the constraint violation variable, and then you know. But the main thing here is that we have this KL divergence between the distribution that the victim would see in the undetected environment and the distribution that the victim will see in the presence of the adversary. And we try to keep that small, but also minimizing the accumulated expected return of the victim. Yeah. The problem is, of course, this is a hard estimation problem. You don't get anything for free, right? But it's such a fundamental problem that it makes sense to think about, like, you know, how can we estimate this better? One issue with the estimator is that we have this nested estimation. So the KL divergence is like a product times a log of something, right? And so it's like a term times the log of the same term, or a similar term. It's very easy to see that if I just do a nested Monte Carlo estimator, so I'm estimating the thing outside of the log, and I'm also estimating the thing inside of log independently with Monte Carlo estimators. Overall, I get a biased estimator, right? So I can have an infinite sample size, and I still don't get the right value for this estimator. So there's a lot of technically interesting stuff there, and actually there are very similar problems, but distinct though, in fields like Bayesian optimal experiment design and so on that we're tapping into at the moment. So it's like ongoing problems. So with this paper, we do something very, very simple. We assume everything is Gaussian. We assume everything is nice, and we just take single sample estimates of everything. And the nice thing is for the environments that we looked at, which are like the standard benchmark environments, which aren't too stochastic, this actually works. You can see here this little video of like how this looks like in practice. Sort of like guide you guys through it because we don't have the time to. So there's different environments, pendulum. So here you need to bounce this pendulum upright, the card pole. You need to bounce this pole on this little card there. So you can see it's very boring actually when it's done well, right? Yeah, because the pole doesn't move. Then you have hopper. The hopper just needs to like move to the right as fast as possible. And the same for this cheetah here. Okay, and now let's look at a conventional attack. Yeah. So you can see up here, these are the observations that I see as the victim, and this is what's actually going on. Okay. And you can see that this is like fairly jittery. Okay. So hopper, I mean, this is, yeah, you would get suspicious if this is like what you observe as an agent. I think if you have some sort of understanding of like what is actually happening internally. So this is what the victim sees, and this is like what the hopper does is actually going backwards, the cheetah, and getting very, very little return. So here we see a perfect illusory attack. So this is entirely undetectable, and this is handcrafted. This is not learned. So for these simple environments, actually you have some symmetries that you can use to actually handcraft it. So you can see that it looks like totally like the right environment, but actually what's going on is it's actually messing up, right? So yeah, we're falling over, but we think everything is fine.
So here, the victim is supposed to think that, oh, the agent is learning actually quite well, but in reality,
exactly. In reality, it's completely tanking, but the victim, but it still responds like to the victim's actions in the way that it should.
So when you show, for example, the half cheated is supposed to like run forwards. In your example, the attacked half cheater, when
it's actually completely, it's falling on its back and wiggling, exactly. And we can, and so we show that, you know, we can also learn this with our new algorithm, okay? So we can learn and practice, and that's like the important thing, because if you can do that, then you can construct these attacks for like whatever environment you want. Whenever you have a simulated environment of something, you can actually learn it. You can see that like it's the learning is maybe not as nice as you would like it to be, but it's definitely better than what we had before. And we can actually, with our absolute illusory attacks, we actually did like a controlled study with humans. Humans were basically, so the idea is basically like we use the fact that humans have some natural understanding of sort of real-world dynamical systems, and we were just giving them like lots of samples of like these different classes, and they should point out anything that they found anonymous. Like basically that's how we sort of package it. Like we had to put quite a bit of thought into like, you know, to controlling for different things, but the result is even our learned attacks are not really very detectable to humans at all. Which means like if I have human monitors and like some cyber system or whatever, you know, like, you know, maybe these attacks can start being, yeah, human monitoring might not work anymore with these kind of attacks. Where's my mouse? Okay, I don't know. I'll just click on the screen somewhere here and then around. Okay. Well, research opportunities. So one big question is like, are there, and again, we are like in the game setting, right? Like, so let's assume I have an attacker that chooses to be a little bit detectable because they actually want to create some damage. And then the question is, can I do active defense strategies? So can I behave differently as a victim? Can I like avoid like, I don't know, like a dark street or something, you know, because that means like I might, I don't know, be able to avoid getting damage, or so in the best response, or maybe I go down, I don't know, maybe I switch on my surveillance camera or something, you know, and that helps me detect these attacks more. Like, I don't know, right? And obviously there are lots of like technical questions, like how can I learn these attacks? How can I detect better, which we'll talk about in the last section of this talk, which is only going to take 3 minutes. Obviously this whole thing in a multi-agent setting is also super interesting, like so collaborative detection, collaborative attacks, and so on. I actually have a project going on that is called ejecting imposters Among Us. If you know the game Among Us, then it's like exactly this thing.
So how many more slides do you have?
I have a bunch of slides, so I will go through them very, very quickly for the internet. I have one more research project to talk about, but I think it might make more sense. So yeah, this whole is like in the setting of human AI systems, sample efficient statistical detectors, which is the last project. I will go through that very quickly. Yeah, this is basically like, how can I learn better detectors for like anomalies and so on in high-dimensional environments. This is not yet releases has been accepted at AMAS, but it's not yet open source. And we inject some correlated noise into environments, and then we construct like these information theoretical detectors. And obviously, it's a really hard problem. And so basically, what we do is we have like a bunch of different detectors that are specialized for different kinds of anomalies. We use like ensembles over them, and there's a lot to be done there as well. There's a lot of work that needs to be done there. And yeah, so that's like basically the core of like this monitoring and penalization approach in these advanced multi-agent systems. Yeah, lots of things really to look into. So optimization pressure, for example, if I have systems that learn online, so they the policies, for example, of agents and the multi-agent systems like change over time through interactions, so on, then it could be that at the beginning, right, the agents don't have certain capabilities, but because it's optimization pressure to actually pick up these capabilities, I always have to think about what happens in the dynamical system, right? And so yeah, so that's one thing that's like very open. Okay, I conclude by some open problems in multi-agent security, just to give you like some flavor. So virtual companies, for example, I've already talked about this, and what are the security requirements of a virtual company? How can AI contractors from different providers come together and securely and safely interact? Well, there's this whole thing of like, you know, even though I can maybe contain privacy issues, like by looking at individual pieces of a system, if I look at the whole system, you know, I might get much worse issues there. Yeah, this is the other side of multi-agent security, which is like, you know, I can use agents, for example, to simulate I don't know, have economic or geopolitical simulations or whatever, and then plug in LLM agents because I believe that they do better when it comes like, mimicking human behavior, better than like hard-coded heuristics, for example. And then I might want to ask the question of like, what are the biases in these agents, right? Like, are they going to like escalate my whole simulation, and then if I transfer this like to decision-making in the real world, I might have a sober awakening, or those agents actually colluding in simulation and I get the wrong results for my economic simulation and things like this, right? Like, so, yeah, this is very interesting. And we don't really know what's going on, but it is clear that the use of these advanced like generative agents and so on in the military is very actively discussed at the moment, right? So it's important to sort of guide that discussion as well. Decentralized commitment device, I've already talked about it. So like cryptographic commitment devices where you might actually be able to verify, your level of security as active area of research. And I've just talked about this, like in principle, if you use these agents as part of simulations, agent-based models and so on, then you also need to make sure that they behave, right? Otherwise, like you might be misinformed as a mechanism designer. And that's it. Any questions?
Wow, that was exactly 1 hour. Beautiful. Yeah, maybe been 4. It's been 4 hours, but you made it in 1. Yeah. Okay, round of applause.
But brief, yeah, thank you. Questions? Anything? Do you want to go back and should I repeat anything?
Yes. Yeah. So let's go back to.
Sorry, I might have to cut this now in the future a bit.
Yes, to the video bit, because I think there's
a lot
of potential to discuss.
Okay, video bit. So
paper with Tim.
Paper with Tim, yes.
Oh, there's also a question online. Can you send out links to the papers?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have on this one slide, I have the names. So two of the papers are not yet in the public domain. If you are interested in those, yeah, I'll just say my email address. It's cs, so this is Charlie Street at robots.ox.ac.uk. And Chavi's gonna share it. And so you can just drop me an email if you're interested in any of these preprints that are not online. And the illusory text paper is on open review. And the perfectly secure steganography paper is relatively widely publicized. You should be able to find it, yeah, on arXiv, for example. Okay, you wanted to go back to the video.
Yes.
So there we are. What aspect of the video?
So I wanted to ask about the victim's case here. So yeah. I have very limited knowledge about like the reinforcement.
Absolutely, yeah.
Scenarios, but when you say environment state S, I see the checkerboard and I see the agent itself inside the environment, yeah. And I can see that, oh yeah, it's not working as intended. But when we are talking about the victim in this situation, are we assuming that the victim has no observation about the environment and how their model, how their agent is acting inside of that environment? Like, are we just assuming that the victim has only control over, or like observation over the agent's state, and not how the agent is actually like interacting inside of the environment?
Okay, so the idea is, so your threat model, as you say in cybersecurity, is that you are a victim interacting with some environment as part of a stochastic control loop. Okay, so you take an action on the environment sends you back an observation, and then you're trying to, usually like, they have some sparse reward signal. It doesn't have to be like that, but that's like the most setting that you're trying to optimize like over the return. And then you have an adversary, and the adversary intercepts the observation that is coming from the environment. Yeah, usually like you would get like the full state as observation, intercepts it, and sends you something else, right? And like in reality, like usually there might be some things about the true state that you can see as the victim, and there might be some channels that the adversary can intercept. And for example, so in the digital realms, you see this quite a bit. So you can, as an adversary, for example, generate sort of packet streams and just inject them into somewhere, or you are like a load balancer and like the victim, like, I don't know, delays, like has like intercepts the incoming stream or something of jobs and like manipulates it, whatever, and so on. In the real world, what you can do and what we're actually also working on is so-called dynamic patch attacks. So a patch attack is like you can put a sticker on a stop sign that's like properly designed, and then like you have an autonomous car, and autonomous car thinks this is not a stop sign but a traffic light, right? What you could do with a screen, for example, is have dynamic patch attacks. For example, like, you know, you can attach that to the back of like the car in front of you or whatever, and then you can in principle try to fool the autonomous agent into an alternative reality where like the car on the lane is like speeding away and next to it speeding away, and then it's like actually changing lanes and crashing, right? Like so you can have these like consistent attacks, hard to detect attacks, also in the real world. But yeah, I think in digital space, it's quite straightforward how this arises. And actually, so the whole idea for illusory attacks actually came way before I started work on this perfect secure steganography stuff, because I was visiting my colleagues at Cyber Defense Campus in Switzerland, and people were looking at like, how can I detect malicious packet streams in botnet context. And they were looking at like this minimum norm perturbation framework where, like, you know, the attacker incurs some cost that's proportional to the amount of change that I do to like the packet streams. And there was like a senior security engineer, and he came to me and was like, you know, I think this whole setting is entirely unrealistic. Makes no sense. Like, I can use this tool like Cobalt Strike or like whatever, and I can just, you know, forge like packet streams that have whatever distribution completely far away from, like, I don't know, my original packet streams, and it costs me nothing. Right. And so basically that was then, okay, we need to find some other way of formulating this problem. Yeah, anyway, that was a long answer again. Yeah, okay. Any more questions?
I do one about one of the last topics you mentioned, which is this cryptographically based potential protocol, where I assume before any interaction between two autonomous agents takes place, some sort of handshake would have to take place, and that handshake guarantees that no interference has happened, that everyone is working as intended. Is that sort of the idea? And if so, is there potential for that handshake itself to be sort of learned over time? Is that sort of the direction that you're hinting at with your whole talk, that nothing is secure in this way?
So I think again, like sort of like the way and the extent to which different tools such as I don't know, zero knowledge contracts, for example, or secure execution environments and so on, might be useful for these more general AI cases. I think again, like we will probably see like a mix of strategies for different use cases, right? Like, so for example, there are virtual machines for zero knowledge generation, and I can run in principle like a large language model inside one of such machine, and then like you know, I can sort of verify the computation that's being done, and I can like verify that like the model I'm playing with actually has these kinds of weights and like it's doing these kind of computations and so on. But that might be very inefficient computationally, right? For example, so then maybe I'm fine if I have a mediator who's like Amazon and is running like, I don't know, some trusted execution environment or whatever, in which like, you know, everybody sends in their models, and then like, you know, they're like checked or whatever by a third party or something, and that's like good enough. You know, yeah, I think, you know, the interesting thing again is like, what situations do I need what kind of security, and that might be something that we only know once these things have been deployed, right? So it'd be nice if you have these tools, then we can deploy them quickly. Yeah, what are the different trade-offs that we are willing to make? Is that vague enough?
That's fair.
Yeah.
As the system learns sort of its capabilities to like build in. Oh, sorry, did I interrupt someone?
No.
Can you monitor sort of the change within that system and potentially using simple heuristics? The idea here would be you put the system in an environment where it is rewarded for exchanging this information secretly, but then you take it out of that environment and you give it a trivial problem, and you see how it is reasoning, what sort of parts of itself it is activating to solve the trivial problem, and you try to differentiate it.
Yeah, so this is one of the things that we're also trying to define in this paper that's coming out. Is a sort of more like epistemic view, right? Like where I'm like trying to, so in order to detect whether somebody's doing steganography or not, like I could do several things. I could try to look at what is their knowledge. Okay, and usually knowledge would be represented in like, a list of like facts in some formal language. And then, I could remove all references to steganography and what that is and how that works from that knowledge and reevaluate the processing function that this agent uses in order to derive new facts or whatever from a given communication. Okay, and then see whether that changes or not. Right? Does the fact that the agent knows about steganography change the way in which it processes, or does it derive different or other facts from a given communication under that premise? Or alternatively, you could try and derive a grounded processing function, okay, and then basically evaluate that like on the same communications and see whether that yields the same result as the agent's processing function. Okay, so if you are in the epistemic framework, it's actually relatively easy to define that. The big problem is just once you have a generative agent. So a generative agent has knowledge, and we usually talk about local and global knowledge. The local knowledge is the knowledge that is encoded in the prompts that we condition it on, and the global knowledge is the knowledge that is encoded in its weights. And you can think about knowledge that is encoded in the weights as some sort of associative memory. I think that's maybe like, so you have certain input regions, and these input regions basically give access to certain certain sort of knowledge clusters, but that they're not necessarily present for other input regions, right? Because it's always a function of the input, what is going on in the neural network. But yeah, it's really hard to say this neural network has picked up these facts from the pre-training data. Of course, I can look at the pre-training data, and it's also one of the recommendations that we do, and say remove everything about steganography and so on. Certainly always a good idea.
Everything about steganography?
Yeah, for example, how to do steganography, right? Remove all of the knowledge about capabilities you don't want to have in your agent, right? But then the big question is, okay, so the more advanced the agent gets, so first of all, that leads to a performance reduction because and also it's hard to like filter training data to that extent anyway. But then the problem is also that agents obviously can generalize, right? And so they can do things that are not explicitly encoded in the training data. So like I don't have a guarantee that the agent cannot do certain things only because they're not explicitly in the training data. And then also have the issue, of course, like, with like fine tuning and then optimization pressure as the agent is deployed and like updates and so on. And then and the optimization pressure is not just like in the sort of weight update space, but also in the context learning in context space, right? Like, so as the agent like gets more inputs and so on, like it might start to actually be able to learn something from that and so on. So it becomes relatively hard to reason over what like an agent's facts actually are, and it might be very hard even to ask the agent of like, do you know this fact, or like give me a list over all the facts, because there might be things that the agent isn't able to elicit in that way, but can actually elicit in other contexts and things like this. And then in the worst case, and this is all just a safety thing essentially, where like, okay, if everybody is benevolent and nobody is interested in this steganographic stuff going on, okay, then we can try all these different things. Even then, we don't have guarantees. But if I have malicious agents that are like bringing in like that are training like a backdoor, right, inserting a backdoor in like an advanced agent, and once the backdoor is triggered, then the agent suddenly has access to all these like cryptographic functions and can do all these things. Then it becomes even harder, of course. The other problem is also that like a lot of the capabilities that the agent needs to do, for example, advanced steganography, are also needed for more legitimate purposes, such as coordination, for example, right? So randomness, for example, or secure multi-party computation, right? So the very thing that the agent needs in order to preserve privacy violations is also needed to do advanced steganography. So then like, you need to maybe think about, okay, maybe I give access to very specific tools to the agent that can do some very narrow things that the agent needs. But in other ways, I try to use other methods and also suppress other capabilities such that the agent cannot, I don't know, generate like pseudo-random numbers and things like this, right? Yeah. But it's very hard. So the epistemic view, mapping that, it's like at the core of like what a lot of people are trying to do, also with like concept unlearning and things like that. This is like why this is so important. Yeah. Thanks a lot for that question. Any more questions? We're also running over.
Yeah, but I think if there are no more questions, then thank you again for.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Luckily, we have recording of everything what you have said. We can slow it down by 4 times.
I'm really sorry.
Split it up for the
yeah, next time I'll cut it in half maybe, and then it will be more enjoyable. But yeah, thank you so much for coming, everybody.
Thank you for coming.
I know I need to find my mouse again. Where? It's here.